Hello there, welcome to this GCSE History revision video on the making of America. This revision video is about the growth of the USA from 1789 to 1838 and a reminder of the key subgroups that you're going to be learning about throughout this course and the key narratives. This one is going to focus very much on the start of the course about America's expansion from 1789 till 1838. So in terms of the syllabus for this part of the course, the first topic we're going to look at is how and why the USA expanded from 1789 to 1838. The second topic is the expansion of southern cotton plantations and of slavery between 1793 and 1838. And then the third topic is the removal of indigenous people from the East, 1830 to 1838. And the word indigenous refers to Native Americans, or as the textbook sometimes refers to them as Indians. So the assessment for making of America is exactly the same as people's health. So you've got your gateway questions, 1A, 1B and 1C. You've got to write a clear and organised summary for question 2. A why or an impact question for question 3, and then you've got your 18-mark essay question for questions 4 and 5. Okay, so when the United States began as a country, originally there were 13 states of the United States of America, and it's worth you being able to remember what some of those 13 states were. Sometimes comes up as the gateway question. So they were Connecticut, Delaware, Georgia, Maryland, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, North Carolina, South Carolina, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island and Virginia. And these states were based in the east of what is now the United States of America, mainly sort of like in that kind of northeastern region. And you can see from the map there and all the different American states about how America gradually expanded westwards throughout the 19th century. So in terms of the growth of the USA, so the USA was a new democratic republic in 1789, but not democratic in a way that we would perhaps think of a democracy. So only white property owning men were able to vote during this time. There's another map there that shows you the different states and territories of the United States of America between 1789 and 1790, so you can see some of the different states there that made up the 13 states. The lands to the north of the River Ohio were known as the Northwest Territory, and the lands to the south of Ohio were called the Southwest Territory. So that just kind of gives you the ideas about those two different concepts. Now, in terms of the growth of the United States of America, it fought for independence from Great Britain between 1776 and 1783. The British had handed over 230 million acres of Native American lands to the USA at the end of the war, and the Native Americans were not defeated in the war and had basically fought against the United States of America, and so they were angry about this. The USA can also be described as a republic, so it's a country which has no monarch, and the USA followed the rules set out in what was called its constitution, which is a set of rules which says how a country should be run. The USA was also a democracy, which is a system of government where people vote for their leaders, and the growth of America during this time can be described as being extremely fast, and this created tensions which would last for the rest of the century. Particularly tensions around slavery, and this would be a key factor in what would eventually lead to the American Civil War, which lasted from 1861 until 1865. Now, the USA was also known as a federal country, so that means that each of the different states, so states like North Carolina and South Carolina, for example, they each had their own powers. So the states were smaller political units, just like today in the United States of America, that's still the case. Each state had its own government, which was led by a state governor. The state government could make its own laws, but they could not go against the rules set down in the Constitution, and that's still the case today. So the key principles of the American Constitution, the states can't go against that, and it's very difficult for even what's called Congress in the United States of America, which is a bit like our Parliament in the UK, to actually change the Constitution as well. Each state in the USA sent representatives to Congress where they would help to make laws. Each state also helped to elect the president every 4 years. The president can suggest laws, but Congress had to agree to them. Territories were areas with too few people to actually have a state government, and they were controlled directly by Congress. Now, the first president of the United States of America was George Washington, and he was a key person in the defeat of the British within the Wars of Independence. And he was the first president, and he was in charge from 1789 until 1797. So as we've seen, the USA grew rapidly from 1789 to 1838, and this was partly due to the expansion of slavery. So why did America grow so rapidly? Well, one of the reasons for this is that the first president, George Washington, had fought wars with Native Americans, was sometimes referred to as Indians, in the Northwest, and took their lands. Washington actually spent 80% of the government budget in campaigns against Native Americans. They'd been defeated at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, and their leaders had agreed to the Treaty of Greenville, which allowed the USA to take parts of the Northwest Territory under its control. Now, other early presidents of the USA, like Thomas Jefferson, opened the Northwest and Southwest Territories up for settlement, and this encouraged more people to move out west. And gradually more and more territory and more states were added to the United States of America. Slaveholders wanted to expand their plantation businesses, especially in the South of America, which tended to be warmer. And this had a huge impact on the expansion of America as well. Another key event was that the US government arranged the Louisiana Purchase, where they bought 530 million acres of land direct from France in the year 1803. Okay, so America grew rapidly between 1789 and 1838, and you can see there a list of some of the new states that were being rapidly added. A particularly important event was the colony of Louisiana, which was bought from the French in 1803, and this led to a huge increase in territory for the United States of America. Now, President Thomas Jefferson, who was president from 1801 to 1809, was keen to expand across the continent, and particularly create trade routes across the continent of America into the West Coast. And the purchase of Louisiana very much opened up this westward expansion. Now, a couple of individuals that you can see in the picture there are Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, and they were given the task of exploring new lands, and they set out in May 1804 following the Missouri River into the Rocky Mountains through to the Pacific coast. Now, they mostly got on well with the Native Americans. For example, a Shoshone woman called Sagagewa acted as their guide, and their exploration led to a further expansion in the fur trade, and it encouraged other trades to head west. Trade with Native Americans grew, and there were really few problems between the white Americans and the Native Americans before 1840. However, what did happen is the country's growth caused divisions and conflict between different groups living within the USA. So as the USA spread, the Native Americans who had occupied the land moved further west, and that led to tension and conflict between the different Native American groups. So there were divisions between white Americans and Native Americans. So many of the lands taken over by the US government were already occupied by Native American tribes. So thousands of Native Americans were forced to move further west to escape the growing USA. There was also tension between white Northerners and white Southerners. So Northern business owners thought that slavery was unfair competition to their factories, and they also saw slavery as old-fashioned. Now, we're going to look at this in a bit more detail later on, but basically there was a real tension between the North and the South over slavery. The Northern states tend to be against slavery, and sometimes known as free states, and the southern states tended to be pro-slavery and were often known as the slave states. There's tension between white Southerners and white Northerners. So many people in the South thought that Northern business owners were greedy and morally corrupt. They saw a powerful North as a threat to their way of life. And then there was tension between a group of people called abolitionists and other white Americans. So a small number of white and also free black Americans called abolitionists were people who were campaigning against slavery. So, for example, some religious people thought that slavery was morally wrong, and they set about trying to stop the slavery altogether. Okay, so what we're going to look at next is the growth of the Deep South, cotton plantations and slavery. So one of the key things for you to understand is that cotton is absolutely key to the South's economic success through exports and the North through the actual cotton products themselves. So cotton is absolutely key. There are other things that are being traded during this time, but cotton is one of the key economic drivers during this time, and it's a key driver for slavery as well during this time. So the Deep South was open for settlement around 1790. Between 1790 and 1838, there were thousands of slave plantations that were set up. Now, a plantation is a large farm that usually grew a single crop, and there were lots of cotton plantations in these new territories. Enslaved African American people were often marched westwards as slavery expanded. Now, by 1789, slavery was being phased out in the 7 northernmost states, but in the southern states of Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North and South Carolina and Georgia, slavery was rife. So this led to quite a lot of tension and differences between the North and South, particularly over the issue of slavery. Now, in terms of the impact of cotton and slavery on the economy, in the South, cotton made up 42% of all US exports. By 1819, New Orleans was the 4th largest city in the USA. Southern traders shipped cotton to overseas markets in Europe, and between 1815 and 1819, around 100,000 slaves were sold in the South. In the North, northern factory owners brought southern cotton and they turned it into cloth, and this was sold across America. Northern business people invested in the sale of slaves like someone today might invest in a business. So although slavery existed in the South, it was having an important impact on the economy in both the North and the South in America during this time. Okay, so when slavery began in 1789, many thought that it wouldn't last, it was outdated and old-fashioned, and it meant there weren't actually very many campaigns to end slavery. But by 1820, slavery was still growing. Now, there are several reasons for this, and we're going to look at these in a bit more depth and detail now. Firstly, slaveholders in the Old South decided to open new plantations in what were called the Deep South. So as America expanded into other southern states, so for example, places like Louisiana, they tended to open up new plantations, and these were involved in the slave trade, and therefore that created an increase rather than a decrease in slavery. Second reason, children of slaves automatically became slaves themselves. Third, new cotton growing land became available in the South after 1790. Number 4, by 1838, the USA was producing over 1 million bales of cotton a year to meet demands from the North and overseas. Slave labour was needed to keep up with this very high demand. The fifth one was that banks were willing to loan money to plantation owners as long as they were paid back with interest when the harvest eventually came in. So that meant that there was money to fund the creation of these new plantations. The sixth one, many presidents were from the slaveholding South, and therefore they did not want to try to stop the growth of slavery. Presidents like Andrew Jackson, for example, during this time. And then the seventh factor is that in 1793, Eli Whitney invented what was called the cotton gin, which was a piece of machinery which could separate cotton fibres. And this was a really, really important event. We're going to look at this in a bit more detail, but it helped process cotton around 50 times faster than it had been done before. So focus event, Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin. The engraving here shows the significance of the cotton gin. At the centre, the plantation owner and a customer inspect the cotton. The cotton gin was a machine that increased the speed and quality of cotton production, and it speeded up the cleaning of cotton by 50 times. This obviously leads to a huge increase in cotton production and demand for more cotton to be planted, and therefore there's demand for more labour, and therefore this leads to expansion of things like plantations and an expansion, unfortunately, of slavery. So just another focus event, we've already kind of talked about this a little bit, but the Louisiana Purchase that we looked at in the growth of the USA, a really important event, and it led to something, a concept that we call the Cotton Kingdom. So the USA purchased the vast Louisiana colony from France in 1803. In 1812, the new state of Louisiana joined the USA, which was actually, interestingly, smaller than the original French colony itself. By 1819, land to the west of the Mississippi River was added to Louisiana, and 2 more states, Alabama and Mississippi, were added. These new states in the Deep South became known as the Cotton Kingdom. New Orleans became massive, and as we've seen, as early as 1820, cotton made up 42% of all exports. So this expansion that we can see in the map here created quite a lot of tension between the North and the South. So the expansion caused tension as the North grew frustrated and angry at the growing power of Southern slaveholders. In the 1780s, slavery was banned in the North but allowed in the Southwest Territory. This led there to being free states in the North and slave states in the South. So by 1838, there were actually 2 million slaves living in southern states. Slaves could not vote and white Americans had all the power. Many people in the North became worried that slaveholders in the South were just becoming far too powerful. So a handful of abolitionists believed that slavery was morally wrong, it was against the Christian religion, and they spoke out against it. So Christian groups such as the Quakers and the Methodists, especially in the North, spoke out. Some religious groups in the South spoke in favour of slavery. People were worried that if a new slave state or new free state was added to the USA, it would upset the balance of power. And this led to the creation of something called the Missouri Compromise in 1820 to try and resolve this issue. So let's just have a look at the Missouri Compromise. In 1820, it tried to stop the conflict between slave and non-slave states. And basically, it drew a virtual line across the middle of the country. Any states created in the West which fell below the line could be slave states. Those above were free states. So it kind of keeps this division between North and South. It said all territories in the West would be free until they joined as states. It set down a pattern of adding states to the USA in pairs, one slave and one free, to keep the balance of power in government between the slave and the free states, between what were predominantly the North and South states. Okay, so the Missouri Compromise was just that. It was a compromise. It wasn't a solution. So slavery was still creating strains and challenges in American society. And you can see here some of the main concerns there were. So the first one was growing fears about slavery. Southern whites began to worry about risks that came with slavery. For example, in 1883, there'd been a successful slave revolt on the Caribbean island of Saint Domingue. In January 1811, a New Orleans enslaved person named Charles DeLond organised a revolt in the South, which was brutally crushed, but again it was a reminder of some of the fears there were about slavery. And opponents of slavery in the North said slavery was outdated, it relied on violence, but many in the North were also worried about rebellion and what would happen if enslaved people were freed. Remember that there were 2 million enslaved people in the South at that time. There's growing power from slavery as well, so as the South grew, it became more influential in US politics. For example, Andrew Jackson was the president between 1829 and 1837. He was from the South. He openly supported slavery. There's growing opposition to slavery with the abolitionists. Some disliked the fact that a black American in the North could be sent to the South if a judge agreed they were a runaway slave. Some abolitionists wanted to free the enslaved people and actually send all black Americans back to Africa. Some abolitionists wished to stir up rebellion in the South. So there's growing opposition to the idea of slavery, and that's creating tensions. And we're seeing here some of the long-term causes of the American Civil War. There's also a growing dependence in America on slavery. So owners of large cotton, tobacco or rice plantations relied on slave labour. However, only a small group of people benefited from the profits. The North also did well out of slavery. The goods made northern factories and businesses profitable. So we're very much sowing the seeds here of the tensions that are going to lead to the American Civil War. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at is the idea of securing growth and the removal of eastern tribes between 1830 and 1838. So the 5 civilized tribes tried to live alongside white Americans. It's worth you remembering and learning their names. The 5 civilized tribes were the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Seminole. Now, in the southeast of America, these key tribes of Native American people tried to adapt and live alongside white Americans. And as I've said, they were known as the 5 civilized tribes. So, for example, the Cherokee tried to use the same political structures as the USA, creating a capital city, using money for the economy. They created their own written language. By the 1820s, the Cherokee had their own churches, schools, their own newspaper, and the other 4 tribes began to take a similar approach to the Cherokee. Okay, so we've already seen that America expanded westwards during this time, and as this began to happen, white settlers and cotton planters demanded the removal of Native Americans from the east to free up land. So white settlers had begun going into the lands of the 5 civilized tribes as early as the 1790s. Many of the settlers wanted to farm the land or create plantations for slaves. However, a key turning point was that in 1829, the slaveholder Andrew Jackson, who was president from 1829 to 1837, became president of the USA. Now, he persuaded Congress to pass the Indian Removal Act in 1830, which was a law which promised tribes money if they agreed to relocate. Now, Jackson set aside a permanent Native American territory, a piece of land especially put aside for the Indian nations west of the Mississippi River in modern-day Oklahoma. He believed that the Indian nations needed to be treated like children, and he said that moving west would be in their best interests. Of course, many Native Americans were extremely angry about the Indian Removal Act of 1830, and the different tribes responded to it in the following ways. So the Choctaw and the Chickasaw, they quickly signed treaties and began moving west. Between 1831 and 1833, the Choctaw gave up around 11 million acres of land, and about 15,000 moved to Native American territory. But despite their cooperation, thousands died due to the harsh winter and the lack of government funds and of disease as well. The Cherokee tribe took their case to the Supreme Court to complain about the actions of the state of Georgia in trying to remove them. In 1832, the Supreme Court ruled that the Cherokee should stay. The Creek tribe, they refused to sign any treaties at all. Okay, so between 1830 and 1838, the US government used a range of tactics to remove eastern tribes, which caused a lot of suffering. So the Seminole, they were a Native American people who lived in Florida in the 18th century. A small group of them had signed a treaty with the US government and moved to Indian Territory in 1830, but not all Seminole had agreed to go. So the government declared war against them in what were known as the Florida Wars or the Seminole Wars, and it cost the US government $40 to $60 million. The US lost the war, but had Esquila, the Seminole chief, killed during peace talks, and after this the remaining Seminole were pushed west. The Creek signed a treaty giving up some of their Alabama land in March 1832, and in return each of them was promised an individual piece of land. But some white settlers moved onto land which had not been sold in the treaty, and the Alabama government did nothing to help. By 1835, the Creek began attacking the settlers and stealing the livestock. So between 1836 and 1837, the army forcibly removed over 15,000 Creek to Native American territory. By 1837, 15,000 had moved west. So we can see here that the US government was using a range of different tactics, such as treaties, for example, putting white settlers on the land, but also using conflict and war as well. Okay, and finally the Cherokee. Most of the Cherokee refused to move after the Supreme Court judgment of 1832. In 1835, some key Cherokee people, such as Elias Boudinot, signed a treaty and headed west. Most of the Cherokee population rejected the treaty and campaigned to Congress. By 1838, only 2,000 Cherokee had moved west, and the army was sent to remove the Cherokee who had stayed in Georgia. The Cherokee were forced into concentration camps until the winter. The Cherokee were forced march to Native American territory on what was known as the Trail of Tears, where 4,000 Native Americans died due to cold, hunger, and disease. By 1838, the Jackson government had removed 46,000 Indians, Native American people, from their lands. Okay, so thanks very much for listening. That was a revision video on the making of America, and that was on America's expansion from 1789 to 1838. Thank you for listening.